Hello and welcome to the book show on Diversity TV. I'm Ava Colopy, a writer of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. My Facebook and website are Ava Colopy Books. And today I'm going to talk to you about a book series called the Earth Children series. And I'm going to talk about it with particular delight because it was written by a fellow Oregonian, Jean M. Auel, from my wonderful, beautiful, fantastic state of Oregon. So this book series now has 6 parts to it. I am really only familiar with the first 4, which were read to me as a child. These books first came out in the 1980s, and my mom had the first 3 books. She began reading them to us when I was 5 years old. It was a particular delight to have my mom read books to you because she would come up with a different voice for every character and absolutely make the books come alive. Whereas my dad, though great at many things, he was a monotone book reader. Really good at reading us the funnies out of the paper and explaining the jokes to us, though. And he was the first person to talk to me about how hardship for the German people in the interwar years between World Wars I and II was why the Nazis were able to seize power. He also talked to me about Hitler being on drugs, which really wasn't talked about until very recently, that a lot of the Nazis were basically meth heads, which really explains a lot. So I actually took my dad's thesis and used it for a research paper and presentation in college and got an A, so thanks, Dad. My parents were very well-read, very intelligent, and critically thinking non-college graduates. So anyway, these books were a big part of my early childhood, even before I could read. And my big sister, Elmira, was an even bigger fan of them and reread them when we were still kids. I'm a slow reader, but my supposedly special needs sister could read one of these 850-page, very well-researched books in about 4.5 days, and remember a lot of it. So believe me, with reading, she made me look like the special needs sister sometimes. So these books are extremely well-researched. They are about prehistoric Europe and how cave people lived. This narrative centers around Ayla, a girl who has to fight through the patriarchy of the time. Now, there's one point in the story even where she is shunned by the cave tribe that she's become a part of. And at the time, she is actually pregnant because she has been raped by the son of the tribe's leader. And the tribe's leader is a good man, but his son is just a terrible brute, a spoiled brat who does whatever he wants. And he's just absolutely miserable character. And she has to somehow survive and learn how to hunt for herself and fend for herself and give birth to a baby all by herself while she's shunned. And some of this happens over the winter time, and the tribe has assumed that she's dead, and she comes back with the baby in her arms and rejoins the tribe, and they are shocked. So she is a very strong character and a very strong person. Now later, she's been adopted into the tribe because her family has died. So later she studies under the tribe's medicine man, who is a partially disabled person who originally, he was going to lose all his status in the tribe, but he became the medicine man and then he had status. And there's a point at which he actually argues for her value in the tribe, and points out there was a time he was considered not valuable anymore. So she eventually studies under him and gains status in the tribe before she leaves them and goes off on her own adventures as an independent woman who knows how to wield a weapon. Now, it is by centering this story around likable characters like Ayla, who is likable and relatable, and we are sympathetic towards her in much of the story, that makes this prehistoric knowledge reading interesting and accessible. Work like this really makes the argument for the power and importance of characters and storytelling in history writing and in teaching. So I will say this relates back to the work that I've been doing as a history teacher. because in this past year I started doing that full time. And at first, you know, I was making the mistake of going, oh, what are my state standards, and what do I have to teach by, and what are those boxes that I have to tick, and getting really worried about that, to the point that it was, of course, kind of boring. I would see my students' interest kind of peak up a bit when I started talking a little bit about the different historical figures, but then I'd say, well, we don't really have time to cover that because, you know, I have to prepare you for this test. So since then, since I've been able to get a better handle on the work that I'm doing now, I really hone in on those historical figures and on telling their story. Because, for example, if I'm teaching you about the 1920s in the United States, of course, I have to teach you about some of the economics and some of the legal changes. We have 18th Amendment prohibition illegalizes alcohol. We have 19th Amendment women get the right to vote in on the federal level. Some of the states had voting rights, but now we have it on the federal level. And if I just focus on describing that, we're going to have a very boring class. But if I take that as a stepping off point to say, okay, prohibition, Al Capone rises to power selling illegal alcohol, and he's getting it out of the South, where the moonshiners are, because we don't have northern moonshiners. Northerners can't do that. So he goes to the South, and he goes to Arkansas, and he gets his moonshine, and he has this whole empire, this criminal empire up in Chicago. You know, that's a much more interesting story, and it helps fix it into your mind. Well, where did Al Capone get his money? He got it from alcohol. How could he get it from alcohol? Prohibition, illegalized alcohol. Okay, but if I just focus on that legal side, it's very boring. Same thing with 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment, women get right to vote, more power and freedom and independence in the 1920s. So let's focus on, say, the movie star Greta Garbo and this career that she has. Or, you know, Amelia Earhart wants to promote equality for women, and she's flying airplanes, and she wants to set some records. Some of the records that she set, they were her records, even though there were other female pilots of her time that were actually even more accomplished as aviators, but she was going on these speaking tours around the country and really trying to promote this equality of the sexes, not man-hating, but equality. Or if I talk about women like Elizabeth Arden, who makes a lot of money as an entrepreneurial woman of her time, selling products by women for women, that's a much more interesting story and really gets you more interested in the history than if I just focus on the technical things, the economics and the legal things that happen. Then we have a very dry lesson that is very, very boring for me to teach and very boring for you to try to learn. So I, for one, find ancient history really boring. I have never enjoyed studying it. I find more recent histories more interesting, because if we study, for example, colonialism, we understand why the world is the way it is today, why the map of Africa, the continent, is carved up the way it is. We get that understanding. So I find that more interesting because it's more relevant to today. But by telling a character's story, as with Ayla, it makes this information more interesting, more accessible to us, and engages us in a way that we just can't have if we're just focusing on sort of the quote-unquote boring facts of, yes, this is the evidence tells us people must have lived this sort of way back then. Instead, it's, let's find out what happens with Ayla and what's going to happen to her next in her adventures. So speaking of that, I am going to read the beginning of the first book, The Clan of the Cave Bear, where we first get introduced to Ayla. The naked child ran out of the hide-covered lean-to toward the rocky beach at the bend in the small river. It didn't occur to her to look back. Nothing in her experience ever gave her reason to doubt the shelter and those within it would be there when she returned. She splashed into the river and felt rocks and sand shift under her feet as the shore fell off sharply. She dived into the cold water and came up sputtering, then reached out with sure strokes for the steep opposite bank. She had learned to swim before she learned to walk, and at 5 was at ease in the water. Swimming was often the only way a river could be crossed. The girl played for a while, swimming back and forth, then let the current float her downstream, where the river widened and bubbled over the rocks. She stood up and waded to the shore, then walked back to the beach and began sorting pebbles. She had just put a stone on top of a pile of especially pretty ones when the earth began to tremble. The child looked with surprise at the stone rolled down of its own accord, and stared in wonder at the small pyramid of pebbles shaking and leveling themselves. Only then did she become aware she was shaking too. She was still more confused than apprehensive. She glanced around, trying to understand why her universe had altered in some inexplicable way. The earth was not supposed to move. The small river, which moments before had flowed smoothly, was rolling with choppy waves that splashed over its banks as the rocking stream moved at cross purposes to the current, dredging mud up from the bottom. Brush close by the upstream banks quivered, animated by unseen movement at the roots, and downstream boulders bobbed in unaccustomed agitation. Beyond them, stately conifers of the forest into which the stream flowed lurched grotesquely. A giant pine near the bank, its roots exposed and their hold weakened by the spring runoff, leaned toward the opposite shore. With a crack, it gave way and crashed to the ground, bridging the turbid watercourse, and lay shaking on the unsteady earth. The girl started at the sound of the falling tree. Her stomach churned and tightened into a knot as fear brushed the edge of her mind. She tried to stand but fell back, unbalanced by the sickening swaying. She tried again, managed to pull herself up, and stood unsuddenly, afraid to take a step. As she started toward the hide-covered shelter set back from the stream, she felt a low rumble rise to a terrifying roar. A sour stench of wetness and rot issued from a crack opening in the ground, like the reek of morning breath from a yawning earth. She stared uncomprehendingly at dirt and rocks and small trees falling into the widening gap as the cooled shell of the molten planet cracked in the convulsion. The lean-to, perched on the far edge of the abyss, tilted as half the solid ground beneath it pulled away. The slender ridgepole teetered undecidedly, then collapsed and disappeared into the deep hole, taking its hide cover and all it contained with it. The girl trembled in wide-eyed horror as the foul-breathed, gaping maw swallowed everything that had given meaning and security to the 5 short years of her life. "Mother! Mother!" she cried as comprehension overwhelmed her. She didn't know if the scream ringing in her ears was her own in the thunderous roar of rending rock. She clambered toward the deep crack, but the earth rose up and threw her down. She clawed at the ground, trying to find a secure hold on the heaving, shifting land. Then the gap closed, the roar ceased, and the shaking earth stilled, but not the child. Lying face down on the soft, damp soil, churned loose by the paroxysm that convulsed the land, she shook with fear. She had reason to fear. The child was alone in a wilderness of grassy steppes and scattered forests. Glaciers spanned the continent on the north, pushing their cold before them. Untold numbers of grazing animals and the carnivores that preyed on them roamed the vast prairies. People were few. She had nowhere to go, and she had no one who would come and look for her. She was alone. The ground quivered again, settling itself, and the girl heard a rumbling from the depths, as though the earth were digesting a meal gulped in a single bite. She jumped up in panic, terrified that it would split again. She looked at the place where the lean-to had been. Raw earth and uprooted shrubs were all that remained. Bursting into tears, she ran back to the stream and crumbled into a sobbing heap near the muddy water. But the damp banks of the stream offered no refuge from the restless planet. Another aftershock, this time more severe, shuddered the ground. She gasped with surprise at the splash of cold water on her naked body. Panic returned. She sprang to her feet. She had to get away from this terrifying place of shaking, devouring earth, but where could she go? There was no place for seeds to sprout on the rocky beach, and it was clear of brush, but the upstream banks were choked with shrubs, just sending forth new leaves. Some deep instinct told her to stay near water, but the tangled brambles looked impenetrable. Through wet eyes that blurred her vision, she looked the other way at the forest of tall conifers. Thin beams of sunlight filtered through the overlapping branches of dense evergreens, crowding close to the stream. The shaded forest was nearly devoid of undergrowth, but many of the trees were no longer upright. A few had fallen to the ground, more leaned at awkward angles, supported by neighbors still firmly anchored beyond the jumble of trees, and boreal forest was dark and no more inviting than the brush upstream. She didn't know which way to go, and glanced first one way, then the other with indecision. A tremble beneath her feet while she was looking downstream set her in motion, casting one last yearning look at the vacant landscape, childishly hoping that somehow the lean-to would still be there. She ran into the woods. And that is how the story of Ayla starts. And she goes on an incredible journey. So thank you very much for watching the book show on Diversity TV, and we will see you again next time.